Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today we are graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, how old you are, and share your story with us today.
Thank you, Gertrude. Hello, everyone. My name's Rosemarie Draper. I'm currently in the Mornington Peninsula of Victoria, Australia, in a township called Rosebud, where I've lived for over 27 years, but recently moved from the family home since my two children have grown up and moved out, and my husband has just retired. So we've sort of downsized into a nice little cottage just near the beach. So that's where I'm based. I think I mentioned already I'm 63 years old. And for over 40 years, I've been a social worker. But if we start my life story, which is quite a diverse one, I was born in a country in Asia called Burma at the time, now called Myanmar. Born in a Muslim hospital, the Muslim Free Dispensary, in a country that was predominantly Buddhist. And so my very early years was in this lovely multicultural, multi-religious sort of setting where, as far as I'm aware, there was quite a bit of harmony. Unfortunately, things significantly changed back in 1962 when post-war, post-independence, there was a military coup in Burma. And everything changed for my family. Even though both my parents had been born in Burma and I had been born in Burma, we were, and my dad had actually been in the Burmese Navy, we were still considered sort of foreigners because of my mixed racial heritage. So I have a very mixed racial heritage. People, it's hard to know. I suppose the best word is Eurasian, because I've got a combination of Burmese, Indian, and different European nationalities sort of mixed into my heritage. My father had a British surname, in English, whereas my mum had a Scottish surname because of their mixed heritage. And when the coup happened in Burma, we had to get out of the country basically because things became very difficult for my parents, who had been brought up in a country where English had been the first language because of the colonial British history of Burma. And then everything changed to Burmese. They weren't, their jobs, everything about life in Burma changed dramatically once the military took over. And because of that mixed heritage, I had the rights of British citizenship. So even though my mother wanted to come to Australia, lots of Anglo-Burmese families were trying to escape Burma at the time. And we just ended up going to live in London, where I had a grandmother and aunts and an aunt and uncle. So when I was 4, I moved to live in London, where I went to school and grew up and had a very interesting range of friends in that very different sort of ethnic makeup to here in Melbourne. So, you know, a lot of the friends I grew up with were from the Caribbean islands, and, you know, Poland and, you know, a whole range of different nationalities with my Catholic background. Think of the countries which have mainly Catholic, you know, faith. So, you know, Polish, Maltese, a whole lot of different ethnic, as well, of course, as English people. But yeah, so I loved the ethnic mix of where I grew up in the East End of London. Then, I mean, it's changed in those years, but at the time. And then when I was 16, my mother had continued her wanting to migrate to Australia and ended up working for the Australian High Commission and managed to get us accepted as one of the last assisted passage migrants to Australia. So in 1976, when I was age 16, and I must say quite reluctantly at the time, we got on a ship and left behind our family in London and started a new life in Melbourne, Australia. So I've lived here now for over, it's 42 years plus. My maths isn't great, but yeah. So I came out to Australia age 16. I managed to just have to do 1 year of school before I was accepted into university. So I did like what they called HSC then. And I'd always wanted to be a social worker. I didn't even really know what a social worker did at the time, but it just seemed to me something that would be really interesting because I'd get to meet people and learn their stories. And I think that was one of the fascinations for me, knowing, meeting people who are different, who had a different background from me. I've always been fascinated by the human race and its diversity. So, yes, so we ended up initially in a part of Melbourne called Elwood. I went to Elwood High School, and there, it's a lot of the students that I met. There was a whole range, but there was a Jewish group that I really made friends with and learned a little bit more about the Jewish faith, which I had always had a fascination with. But of course, like coming to Australia and not knowing anything really about about Australian history, I also had a fascination and a desire to find out about our First Nation people, the Aboriginal people. So as I went on to university, got a degree in social work, and have worked in a number of different roles. I've worked in hospital social work, I've worked in crisis centres, I've worked for migrant resource centres, and for a long time in the latter part of my career, I've worked as an aged care social worker. But during that time, I have been privileged to meet so many different people, not only in my professional life, but in my personal life, because I actually made it a mission, I suppose, to actually meet and get to know the local Aboriginal community. So I did that many years ago and introduced myself and asked questions and got to know people, and have since then had a very rich relationship with our local Aboriginal community. I'm a member of 2 Aboriginal gathering places, one on the Mornington Peninsula and one in a local suburb called Frankston. And they have enriched my life in many ways. Also, in my work, I was fortunate enough, as well as working at a migrant resource centre, but in my aged care social work role, also took on another role as what in the organisation I work with, as what they call a diversity coordinator. So that has enabled me to meet with people from very diverse backgrounds, and to look at what some of the barriers are for them being able to receive and access the services that most of us take for granted. And so, I've worked on so many different projects. For example, I've worked with the LGBTI community, worked on a transgender, gender diverse project in which we, developed sort of tips, from which we learned from people with lived experience about how our staff, we have nurses who provide care in people's homes, how our staff could, have the knowledge so that they can ask questions in a respectful manner, and the sorts of guidelines. I mean, we developed guidelines for working with transgender and gender diverse people. We also, in consultation with Aboriginal communities throughout Melbourne, developed guidelines for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. I've also been involved in a number of other sort of diversity initiatives at work. We've developed, for our organisation, a diversity framework. We developed what we call a conceptual tool called the diversity conceptual model. And I mean, it's hard to explain it, but in my social work experience, I've looked at so many different things that have impacted and made it cause barriers for people to actually be able to get the services that they need. And so working with, as a diversity coordinator with a brilliant colleague called Jacqueline and Michael, we helped develop the model, which has helped us respond to diversity in a more appropriate manner. It's hard. Gertrude, did you want to?
From such an interesting background, you are literally a cocktail of nations, is the way I can describe you, Rosemary. You are a mixture of so many different countries. And in diversity terms, it's referred to as intersectionality.
Yep.
So how have you managed to navigate your life living in so many different worlds? How does that play out for you as a person?
Look, I think one of my personality traits, and thank goodness it is adaptability and that fascination with difference. So I think that how I manage to is just when I'm in a new situation, I want to learn. I want to know what the people around me think are norms, and not necessarily always conform to those norms, but to understand them and and have respect for them, so that that you can work and just interact comfortably with different types of people. I mean, I just love. I mean, I haven't mentioned that when I first got married, before we had children, my husband and I backpacked around the world for 6.5 years and spent time in every continent, just so that we could get to meet different people with, different ways of life, different ways of thinking. So I think that's the reason I've been able to, adapt to different cultures, because I'm fascinated by them.
I love that. So can you share how your work in social work since 1984 has shaped your understanding of diversity and disadvantage in various settings?
Yeah, I think I was about to sort of go into that a little bit. when I was just talking about my life story. I think like in that, I mean, it has been since 1984, so it's a long time, decades, and in different roles. And a lot of the time in my roles, I sort of saw my, like, you know, when I was a hospital social worker or a child protection worker, or, you know, the different things I've done in my life, I sort of saw the cultural diversity issue almost as something separate and something I pursued in my personal life. And then suddenly I began to realise how important it was to bring that together. And so for many years, a lot of my work was ensuring, you know, like things like people got their information, you know, they had professional interpreters, all of that. So cultural diversity was my focus and passion. And then as I went on, I began to actually think more broadly and think about diversity in every form. You know, like every individual is made up of so many different diversity characteristics. And that diversity conceptual model that I was just referring to earlier looks at some of the diversity characteristics which in my social work experience we know can cause barriers from people equitably accessing health and other services. And so part of what we wanted to do was like to help professionals, other professionals, health and in other fields, understand how they can look at diversity characteristics which may or may not be causing disadvantage. I say may not because, you know, religion, for example, is something which can at times cause disadvantage, but in other times can be an absolute strength for a person. So it's looking at that individual's, you know, cultural health beliefs, whatever it might be. So what we did to make it easier is develop what we call digital diversity stories. And so anyone can access these on the internet and listen to like a scenario, a case that I would have written up, which was based on real life. And during that, we pull out what the different diversity characteristics of that individual was. And then that way you can then look at what are the things that are barriers and disadvantaging this person. How can we change things for them? What do they want? Because that's crucial. What do they want? And work together with them in that way. I hope that makes sense. It's hard to sort of put it together in just sort of a few words.
So in your experience, how have you addressed cultural diversity in your roles, especially in the hospital social work and child protection?
You know, that I have to say, hospital social work was like in the 1980s. So we're talking like a long time ago. But having said that, and like some of my child protection work was in the 90s in the UK. But with both of them, you know, like I've mentioned, you know, how important it was to work with the interpreters, how important it is for hospitals to realise the importance of using professional interpreters, because back in those days, you know, they were using inappropriately family members, you know, young children to discuss
the language.
you know, all of those sorts of things. So, you know, in those days it was like we had an interpreting team that I worked very closely with and actually question them also about cultural issues, but you never assume just because, you know, someone might be, you know, whatever Greek background that they are going to affiliate, you know, actually fit a stereotype. You've got to treat everyone as an individual, but it was good to get some additional, and I think it's always good. So working with professional interpreters is really important. With the child protection, it's the same thing, you know. It's knowing, listening to people and listening to what they want. And in child protection, it's not always, you know, a question of what they want. It's that you have to put the child's interest as paramount. But looking at ways that we can get the family to be supported appropriately so that they can provide that child with the care that, and meet the child's needs in a way that is culturally appropriate, acceptable to the family, and helping the other professionals that you're working with understand that as well, if that makes sense. And, I did that again in the 2000s because I did a 6-month locum in the Northern Territory where I worked with, and there it was a very different situation in that was the years where we had the intervention in Australia. The government at the time actually shelved the Racial Discrimination Act, and I won't go into the politics of it because I disagreed personally with what was going on, but it was a very it was a fascinating time, and I wanted to see this intervention up close. I wanted to understand why the government was doing what it was doing, but also all the negative impacts of that. So it was very important to not only work with the children and the families, but also up in the Northern Territory, we had Aboriginal workers that were based with the department. So actually learning very much from them. And it was a huge learning experience, especially when you were dealing with people like, again, it's hard to encapsulate all of it very shortly, but there are so many things that I knew nothing about, even though I'd worked a lot with the Aboriginal community in down south in Melbourne. Being up in the Northern Territory, there were a whole lot of cultural protocols that I knew nothing about, and I had to learn. Yeah.
So can you tell us about your voluntary work providing English conversation classes for immigrants and refugees and its impact on these communities?
You're going back even further when you're asking about that, because I actually did those English conversation classes back at university in the early 80s it would have been. But what was lovely about it was that, it was a chance to, at that time there were a lot of people coming from Vietnam and from South America, and it was wonderful to have the opportunity to meet them and to help them, with their English conversation, but also just sort of understanding some of the ways of life in Australia, which I think it can be very bewildering when someone first comes. But the other thing is I also found out from them where they got the most help and the places that supported them most. And at the time, it's a place called the Springvale Community Aid and Advice Bureau, and I actually ended up volunteering there as well, and ended up going on their committee and ended up being the chairperson of the organisation, working alongside a wonderful woman called Merle Mitchell. And Merle, many years later, decades later, decided to do a project about the Enterprise Migrant Hostel, where a lot of the people that's where the English classes occurred, and that hostel had closed down. But so 30 years later, we had an exhibition about that time at the Immigration Museum here in Melbourne, and I got to meet a whole lot of people who had gone through the Enterprise hostel, who I had known many years before, and that's where the impacts came in. Their stories and about how much help that the bureau, the English classes, all of those things, and what a difference it made to them, so that to establish themselves in their new lives in Australia was really heartwarming. But it was also sad because a lot of migrants nowadays and refugees don't have that support any longer.
Yeah. So how do you approach mental health issues in your work, particularly considering the diverse backgrounds of the individuals that you assist?
Look, that's such a broad question. I mean, like there is different aspects. There are those who might have come from a background of trauma and torture, and so how you work with people with that background can be different. And when I say different, it's also the other organisations and colleagues that I might refer people to help support the person. So if we're talking mental health in those terms, there are amazing organisations in Melbourne like Foundation House and others that do a great job in supporting people with a torture and trauma background. But, like a lot of the time it's just finding out, as I said, from people's stories, what is it that they want? What are what are the barriers for them to live the sort of life that they want to live, and look at what the best supports are. So it might be something as simple as someone who's been depressed for many years and doesn't feel that there's anything that they can do about it, and to get them to the stage where they're willing to talk to their GP about it, develop a mental health plan, and then that will entitle them to maybe counselling with the psychologist or whatever it might be that they want. So there are different types of mental health issues. There are different ways of dealing with it. It's wonderful if you can actually access the services of a mental health nurse to support you with the work that you're doing as well. Yeah, so it's a whole range of different things.
So what insights have you gained from your role as an inspector of the children's services in terms of ensuring equitable access for all children, regardless of their diversity characteristics?
Gertrude, again, that job was many years ago. That was in England in the, when would it have been? The very early 1990s that I was an inspector of children's services. So that was a whole different era and a different country. But what had happened was that in England they had just introduced a Children and Young Persons Act. And so for the first time in legislation, childcare, centre operators, people who looked after children for money in their own homes, family daycare, all of those people were covered under this act. And for the first time, they had a legal obligation to demonstrate how they were responding to diversity. And so for many people that I was like going and doing inspections for, it was more like supporting them to sort of understand that, maybe what they should be doing is changing their practice so that they better met the needs of their clientele. So, for example, many childcare centres were, in those days, like they would do, things for Christmas and Easter. And I'd say, but, this is a part of London where you've got children who are, Hindu, you've got children who are Muslim, you've got children from Asian Orient, backgrounds, do you know about Lunar New Year? Can you celebrate Lunar New Year? What are the things that these children can, Diwali, Hanukkah, whatever it might be, so, I mean, it was on that very early support level to just get them thinking differently, giving them practical strategies, to actually talk to the parents about what, find out from them what sort of things that they would love to see their children participate in. And, that it was on that level, back in the early 90s,
So being honoured with the OAM in June 2023 is a significant achievement. How do you feel this recognition reflects your commitment to diversity and social work?
Well, I think that's why I got it. I think it's because of both my, paid work and my voluntary work, because I have, I'm a justice of the peace. I do this, I do that, whatever it might be, working with different community groups and women's groups, all of that sort of thing. And with all of it, I do bring my diversity lens to it. So I think that's probably why I was honoured. It's not a system I know very much about until they got in touch with me and said, would you accept the honour? Apparently after, because they wouldn't even tell me who nominated me, but in Australia, anyone at all can nominate anyone else. And so it was actually my daughter who made the original nomination, but she had given references of other people who knew me in different, some of my voluntary work, in my paid work, and all of that. And apparently, it's a huge process where they check people and find out more about them and all of the rest of it before they actually decide whether or not you're going to receive an honour. So for the first, because of course before that was the first year where it was a king's birthday honour as opposed to a queen's birthday honour, and it came and it was, they say an honour, and it is an honour. It's a privilege to have your work recognised, but it's also a bit I wouldn't say embarrassing, but like I haven't really publicised the fact that I got the OAM much. So a lot of my friends don't actually know about it yet.
Very
and also,
humble.
well, not so much that. Also, it happened when at a time, my husband had just retired, and we had, before I knew about it, had already planned to go overseas as part of, and we went on a 5-month trip to Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. So I couldn't even go to Government House to get my medal, but I'll do that next year.
Oh, that's awesome. So finally, what advice would you give to emerging social workers who want to effectively address diversity and disadvantage in their practice?
I suppose the main thing is to make sure that you like I said, I mean, before I sort of almost saw my diversity passion as something separate from my everyday social work. But in fact, now I see it as absolutely integral. And also that they need to, I suppose, look at everything with a diversity lens. And as I said, diversity for me is a huge broad concept, which is much more than cultural diversity, which a lot of people assume when they hear the term diversity, but it is looking at every individual that they work with and working out what it is about them that makes them the unique person that they are, and what might be affecting their ability to get access to the services that they need. So look at everything with a diversity lens.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Rosemarie, for coming online today and sharing your amazing story with our community. It's inspiring to see somebody who's so multifaceted, not just in your own personal being, but you have transferred that into your work as well. Thank you for your work. I'm really sure you deserve the honor that you got.
Thank you. And can I just point out the artwork behind me? I don't know if you can see it properly, but that's my daughter's an artist, and she went to Mexico and did an art residency there. And so that's sort of some of her work. And so, like my daughter has also had she has different skills. She's an artist and I'm not, but, she has also developed a passion for diversity.
Passion. Sounds like it. Takes it from her mom. Thank you so much, Rosemarie.
You are welcome.
And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is bringing you stories from all walks of life, from interesting people. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and bye for now. Thanks again, Rosemarie.
You're welcome.
That's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely